So it's estimated that there were about 250,000 Native Americans in what is now Canada and the United States. And those territories, it's often romanticized of how the Native Americans were at one with nature and had peace. But the reality is that there was a chronic issue of overpopulation in that there wasn't a sufficient food supply for the number of people that were living there. And as a result, hunger and famine were a real and present issue in the Native American lives. They began living in more tight-knit communities and became ever more dependent on corn as their main food crop. And this created a susceptibility to diseases. Many times we hear that the population of the Native Americans was affected by European diseases, and they certainly did play a part, but the majority of Native American deaths are actually attributed to African diseases. When we look at specifically New England, there were around 60,000 Native Americans that were living there at the turn of the 17th century, and their population was already declining. It had been declining for 100 years already, even before Columbus had sailed across the Atlantic. And the Patuxet tribe was one of those fiercest in the region, and they had been entirely wiped out before the Pilgrims arrived by several years. It was this homeland of theirs, which remained unoccupied, that was chosen as the site for the Plymouth settlement because it was unoccupied.
So remember when we talked about the Pilgrims' desire to come to America to evangelize the New World, to be missionaries. And we also talked about colonialism and colonization and how the Spanish would evangelize at the point of the sword, so forced conversion, and how the Pilgrims, because of their Reformation heritage, wanted to do the opposite. They wanted to build communities and build relationships with the native populations and preach the gospel and allow God to transform hearts. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that looked like. And when the Pilgrims first arrived, as Curtis described previously, the Indians did approach them, and they started developing relationships through trade, and they were helping, the Indians were really helping them in a lot of ways. And one of the biggest turning points in the Pilgrims' favor was when they were able to use Western medicine, which obviously had big limitations, but they were able to use the medical knowledge that they had to help Chief Massasoit when he was close to death. So the natives started to see, oh, they're doing things differently. And then probably the biggest influence, though, in their evangelism was the way they declared God's providence. So when God provided a harvest, an amazing harvest after that first winter, they declared a day of thanksgiving. And this was not just a party where they had fun and ate a lot of food. It was specifically crediting God and giving God glory for providing for them. And the Indians saw this, that they recognized, oh, they're giving credit to their God. So their God's the one taking care of them. And during their second summer, so this is their second planting, they get all the crops in the ground, they're expecting a great harvest again, and they have a huge drought through the months of May and June and part of July. And the Indians were saying among themselves, they're dead, they're gone. And the governor declared a day of fasting. And on the very first day of the fast, it started to rain. And it wasn't a hard rain, it was just a gentle, nourishing rain. It was just a remarkable answer from God to their prayers. And one of the Indians declared, surely their God is a good God. So the Indians were seeing that God was taking care of them. And the Pilgrims' habit of giving God credit for caring for them made this even more apparent to the natives. As time passed, and the Pilgrims credited God with nearly every blessing they had, the natives became more and more interested in their faith, and they started dropping off their infants as soon as they were born on the Englishmen's doorsteps. And this really grieved the Pilgrims because they were concerned that the natives saw the gospel as becoming an Englishman. And so they started a concerted effort to make sure the natives understood that pleasing God did not equate with becoming English, and it equated with a heart change and turning to the Lord. And so once the Native population understood this, they started establishing praying towns. And that's what they called them. They were essentially Christian towns where they worshipped the one true God. And within 40 years of the Pilgrims' arrival, there were 4,000 natives in these praying towns.
John Eliot came about 24 years after the Pilgrims, and he saw the great need that there was to evangelize the Indians, and he began his gospel ministry and became known as the apostle to the Indians. He poured out his life in a dedicated service to them. So John Eliot, he saw the need for evangelism to the natives, and he specifically used their language when interacting with them to be able to reach them better. And he developed a phonetically based text or alphabet for them so he could translate various materials into their language so that they could have it in their own language. He first translated the Lord's Prayer and the Ten Commandments, and within 20 years he had translated the entire scriptures, and that was the first Bible published in New England, was in the Wampanoag language. He had a 70-mile preaching span that he traveled around through various villages, preaching and teaching by foot and by canoe. And when the Indians asked him how they should govern themselves or set up their societies, their praying towns, they were directed by him to look at the Bible. And so they look at Exodus 18, where Moses sets up rulers of 10s and 50s. And so the Indians formed their own representative governments based on the standards set forth in the scriptures. And one of the first town covenants reads, "We do give ourselves and our children unto God, and to be his people. He shall rule us in all our affairs, not only in our religion and affairs of the church, but also in all our works and affairs in this world. God shall rule over us." So God truly did work a revival in their hearts and in the minds of the Indians in a profound way.
So you remember us talking about the treaty, the original treaty with the Indians, and that it lasted 50 years. The treaty was broken after 50 years with Prince Philip's War, and many of you have heard of that. There were 1,500 natives that fought in that war, but we know that there were 4,000 in praying towns who did not participate in the war. So the majority were not participating in Prince Philip's War. And everybody, all the history books, record Prince Philip's War and the atrocities that happened with that. But no one remembers the praying towns. Nobody gives credit to God in what he did. It's almost completely ignored in history books. So I think it's important to remember and glorify God for the work of his Spirit among the Indians.